Welcome to the Top Order podcast. The three of us this week coming to you from the truly international podcast that we now are. We're going to have 2 episodes landing in your feed this week. The first of which is a preview of the Border-Gavaskar Trophy. We'll talk some venues and dates, key lineups, key matchups, predictions, and anything else that we get into the scripts that's not already there. And then on our second episode, look out for that in the feed over the course of the next few days as well. We'll have our normal roundup of cricketing news this week in cricket, talking Tim Southey, New Zealand's Test squad announcement, and a little bit of a white ball bonanza as well. But more details on that in your feed very shortly. But stay tuned for the first part of this week's episode, Border-Gavaskar Preview. Stay tuned. Well, boys, I'm slightly premature on the swish there. Let's blame the time difference for that having to make its way 14,000 miles or so up to the northern hemisphere. But look, refreshing to see the refreshments cabinet open in the background. I know little drinks in those stubby holders. Different, aren't they? Stubby holders in my part of the world now. They used to keep your beer warm. And in your part of the world, cold, obviously. So, but yeah, let's not go too much into that. We want to talk some Border-Gavaskar. So we've got a really mouth-watering prospect of a test series coming up. 5 tests, including a day-nighter. Bordy, I'm sure you'll do an explainer in a sec on the venues and whatnot. But do you want to kick off with that, Michael, and give us a little bit of a view of what we can expect for this test series in Australia, and then we'll go into some of the details.
Thanks, Binksy. Welcome everyone to what promises to be an exciting summer of Australian cricket. I'm very much looking forward to this 5-test series between Australia and India in Australia, and it all starts on the 22nd of November in Perth at the Perth Stadium, not the WACA, not the WACA ground, but the new Perth Stadium. And we'll get to talk about the pitch a little bit when we talk about that a little bit later on. So November 22 to 26 is in Perth. Then the Indians play the Prime Minister's 11 in Canberra on the 30th of November. Brief interlude in between the first and second test. The second test is in Adelaide, and I don't believe that this is a day-night test. I'll confirm that later on.
Yeah. It is a day-night test.
Ooh,
yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
So the day-night test in Adelaide then, always a popular venue on the Australian calendar. Australia have been traditionally strong in day-night tests in Adelaide, so that proves to be an exciting fixture as well. Then we go to Brisbane. So traditionally over the last sort of 20 or 30 years has been the first test match of the summer. It's moved around a bit in recent years for various reasons, but they'll play in Brisbane from the 14th to the 18th of December, so just before Christmas. Promises to be hot, promises to be sticky and humid, and also promises to have a little bit of weather around as well, potentially around that time of year.
How do you feel about that? Was it a fixture for you and something you look forward to, being the first test of the summer?
Always did, yeah, absolutely. Particularly as Australia had a very good record playing in Brisbane in the first test of the summer. I think it set ourselves up for strategic advantage throughout the series, because you played, we'll get to the wickets, but you played in 1 wicket in the Gabba, and then you traditionally went to Perth and had a very different experience playing in Perth. So yeah, venue selection has long been a topic of ire for me, but we'll come back to that. We'll continue with the explainer for a bit. Then we go to the traditional Boxing Day test match. So for those of you who don't know, traditionally in Australia, Christmas Day, December 25th, Boxing Day, the day after, December 26th, is the Melbourne test, and that will run 26th through 30 in Melbourne. And then we have the New Year's test in Sydney that will begin on Friday, January the 3rd, and will run through, if we get 5 days of cricket, through January the 7th. And that will conclude the Border-Gavaskar Trophy in Australia between Australia and India.
And Baldy, do you think that one of the things that I always think of in Australia, you didn't touch on the pitches, so maybe we can get into that now, because when I think about Australia, I think, okay, to go to Australia, and what New Zealand has always struggled with is it feels like you've got to bat first, score 450 plus, and then, you can go and dictate the terms of the test match, and you need to, that's how you win a game in Australia. Mm-hmm. When I looked through some of the recent results in Australia, some of the recent since the Cricinfo had an article sort of all about the venues over the last 5 years, it looks like in most venues, the bowling averages have dropped quite significantly, 10, 15 runs. Are we now thinking that you can win test matches in Australia without scoring that 400?
So traditionally, yes, you would need to bat bat big in your first innings in order to set up a victory in Australia. But we've seen a number of instances in this century in particular where that's not the case. I think moving the test matches around in the calendar subtly changes the condition of the wickets in those venues. So later on in the summer, Perth is harder and drier. Brisbane was juicier and seamed around a bit earlier in the season. So all of these subtle changes in scheduling actually have some impact in terms of the Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide tests in particular. Sydney and Melbourne have been locked in for a wee while now in the Boxing Day and New Year's Day test match venues. So you don't get as much in terms of variability year to year in terms of the conditions, although it has rained in Sydney a lot over the last 20 or 30 years in that New Year's test. We'll get onto that. The reality is that averages are coming down because couple of reasons. One is there is a little bit more juice in the wicket sometimes. We've moved away from having bouncy, fast whacker wickets as well, which has changed it a little bit. But also you have to have a look at Australia have lost a shit ton, and I use that word advisedly, and in putting my analytics hat on, of batters who have scored hundreds and big hundreds for Australia over the years. Australia in the last 10 or 15 years haven't had as many of those players other than maybe Smith and maybe some supporting casts. So, have averages come down a bit? Yeah, probably. We've also not played tremendous sides over the last 3 or 4 years in Australia, other than the India series and the England series as well. So, there have been one-sided affairs as well in the last few years that would impact those bowling averages.
Yeah, but Bordy, I want to come to you with a question in a sec, but my 2 cents on what you've just talked about, I think there's 2 or 3 things that spring to mind. So firstly, I think the drainage that we see at pretty much every test ground now, with the exception of where you played Afghanistan, I think, which, let's not wind Stu up about that too much with that test match that never was. But the drainage now has changed the way the wickets work, because it takes so much moisture out of the surrounds, even if you've upgraded that in recent times. And obviously Australia's long had those sand-based outfields, but that's probably changed the character of the wickets a little bit, I think. I think the other thing is the advent of probably the way that cricket's being played now, less preparation. So really interesting that, you look at that schedule. I don't believe the Indians have a formal warm-up game. I'm sure they'll have something in country, but, gone are the days
they played India A, and India A played Australia A, didn't they? And now they're playing an inter-squad India A versus India. But yes, it's not a
what I'm
game.
saying is that's a glorified middle practice as opposed to a game against a state side or the emerging players 11 or whatever it used to be called. So there's probably going to be a little bit less, and that affects Australia as well. I know they're playing obviously Shield cricket at the moment, but not all of those those guys will obviously be playing Shield cricket. But I think the advent of the way that the game's been played as well, Australia are probably closest to their stereotypical style in terms of, they kind of poo-poo Bazball a little bit and say, well, we've been doing it since, Mark Taylor and Steve Waugh were knee-high to a grasshopper. It's just called, mental disintegration and aggressive Matthew Hayden cricket. And so I think Australia probably from a blueprint perspective are going to be closer to bat big, bat once, and put, scoreboard pressure on. But we've seen India, albeit in a losing series against the Black Caps recently, they've tried to set the tone in a way that's, quite similar probably to the way that some teams are trying to speed up Test cricket as well. So it makes for a mouthwatering prospect to see whether Australia, as Baldy alluded to, have the cattle. I think they used that phrase in Australia, have the cattle to actually go out and score 450, 500. Or whether, the fact that they've got a bit of a sort of new look to that batting lineup. No Cameron Green. We'll talk probably about Nathan McSweeney and the permutations that they've got there throughout the course of the series. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how India bounce back and whether Australia can play that blueprint. Now, I said I'd come with a question, and my question is about the way the games work, Baldy. So, I'd be really interested to know what you think about not opening at the Gabatoir, that sort of historic theatre of 27 years worth of victory or whatever it is. I'm sure there's a song about it by Paul Kelly or someone like that. But it was such a fortress for you. It is probably the most different wicket that you're going to play on in Australian conditions. Perth, yes, has a bit of bounce, but can be a really, really good batting wicket, both at the Wacker historically and now the Optus. Adelaide's normally pretty flat, isn't it? Although the pink ball dynamic has changed that a little bit. And then you obviously get to Melbourne, which is a drop-in, sometimes quite placid, and Sydney, where historically it used to turn a little bit. But Brisbane was that place to ambush a touring side, and particularly with no real formal warm-up games. I just wonder whether or not, as an Australian, do you go, we've given away a big advantage leading into the series?
100% true. I always thought that the sideways movement in Brisbane is the thing that undid sides in Australia early doors in a test series. And the Australian bowlers traditionally have been expert exponents at extracting, there's 3 E's for you in that sentence, sideways movement off the seam. Pat Cummins in particular of the Australian fast bowlers now, but also Josh Hazlewood, experts at extracting that sideways movement off the seam. And I just thought that over the years, Brisbane has been the best venue for Australia to exploit that and really set a market down to the opposition batters early on in a big marquee series like this one. So I don't think it matters who you play. Australia have their biggest advantage if they're able to roll sides, particularly with sideways movement in Brisbane. They all enjoy playing there, the players. As a spectator, it's a bit of a concrete bowl, the Gabba, and it has been since it was redeveloped in the late 1990s, in majority for AFL. It's a great venue to watch AFL, but as a cricket venue to watch, it's not as exciting as some of the other like boutique grounds in Australia. Adelaide's got a terrific feel about it. Sydney has got a terrific feel about it with the members and the ladies stand. And then Melbourne is just so big that it feels like a coliseum. So from a spectator's point of view, it's not as nice a venue to go and watch cricket. But in terms of the on-field and overhead conditions that Australia are best positioned to exploit, it actually does set a bit of a marker down. And I think it's harder for sides to come back from having been victim of that sideways movement in the first test to then go to Perth and have excessive bounce and really fast-paced wickets traditionally. Maybe not so much anymore with the Perth wicket, but those two factors combined often had Australia in a 5-test series right on the front foot and had oppositions on the back foot going, well, I've got to adapt to these conditions and now I've got to adapt to different conditions. And now it's flat in Adelaide and all of a sudden Australia have put on 550.
Please try again.
Siri's not happy with
Siri's not happy with my assessment, but I think Australia do miss a trick, Binksy, in not scheduling the first test match in Brisbane. 100% true.
Yeah. Binksy, I just want to, you guys have talked a little bit about the pitches, and Baldy, Binksy, you mentioned the series being, or India's last series in New Zealand, playing New Zealand. I think the key point. Well, obviously, but the key point of that I've taken from listening to you guys, this is going to be a very different series for them, right? We've over there, particularly the last 2 tests, dominated by spin. It seems we're expecting seam to play a much bigger part, and as far as I can tell, I think we're expecting 4 to 5 day tests now. Is that how you're seeing it?
Yeah, look, I certainly think we'll see. Weather permitting, obviously longer test matches. I don't think the game moves quite as quickly in Australia as it does in the subcontinent. And look, that's not rocket surgery. I think in terms of statistics, I've done no analysis on it, but I'm pretty sure that the stats would bear that out as well in terms of average length of test match. And that's just because the wickets don't tend to deteriorate as much, and spin really only comes in relatively late in the test match. I also think India have got a pretty decent recent record in Australia as well. So I think again when I sort of go back and think about it, and I even remember, I think, Stu, back in the early 2000s, a series where India came to New Zealand and just it seemed around all over the shop and they just nicked everything. And gone are those days, I think, of you being able to level that criticism at the Indian teams. That they actually play high quality pace really, really well now. They've got we'll talk lineups, but they've got some quality batters. So I think that the games are going to go a little bit deeper, and I think obviously there is going to need to be that mentality at times to sit in and soak up a little bit of pressure. I think the other thing, and we've talked about this quite often on the podcast, is the effectiveness of the Kookaburra ball. It really only lasts for 10 to 12 overs. And then it very, very quickly shifts to being not easy to bat, but a lot easier to bat than probably the comparable, which is, with that SG or a Duke's ball in India or England, where there's always that little bit of lateral movement for your seamers. So I'm hoping that we are going to see that because I like seeing big hundreds, 150 off 250 balls. It's still no slouch in terms of a strike rate. And it's exciting, exciting cricket and what we're probably used to watching when we were growing up in the 90s and noughties.
It's a fascinating battle when you have a look at the lineups because India, as you said, Adam, are bringing terrific batters, but they're also bringing a terrific pace battery as well to this series. And that's something that India 20 years ago wouldn't have had at their disposal. They might have had one world-class seamer and some really good backups, but they wouldn't have had the best fast bowler in the world and other fast bowlers in that pace battery that either are providing express pace or are providing skilled movement with the seam. And I think if the IPL has brought anything to the fore in India, it's actually lifting up the standard of those pace bowlers over the last 16, 17 years. And so not only are India producing great pace bowlers, they're facing great pace bowlers on a regular basis. They're learning how to deal with that sideways movement. They're learning how to deal with all of those factors. So India are as well poised as ever from a preparation perspective, historically, to be able to deal with that. Whether or not their current form is positioning them well to deal with those factors, it remains to be seen. But yeah, they've certainly got all the tools in the toolkit to be able to deal with Australia's fast bowlers as well as anybody.
I think that's one of the kind of squad questions, if we're moving into that area now, that I have for India, because in my head, I'm thinking they'll play, Ashwin, Jadeja, probably, or at least, some combination of Ashwin, Jadeja, Sundar. Two out of the three of them will play at 7 and 8, and then you'll have three seamers. That's how I'm imagining the side. And one of the key questions is Bumrah, obviously locked in, brilliant bowler. We've talked about him many, many times. Everyone knows, I think, he's the best bowler I would say he's the best seamer in the world, if not the best bowler in the world in general. Siraj, I have a concern about now, basically over the last wee while, and I'm worried about him. I wonder what India is going to do there, because I think Akashdeep has surpassed him slightly in the pecking order in terms of, we saw him play the third test when there was only two seamers for India. Whether that necessarily matters, or sorry, it was the second test. Deep played the third test and Siraj because Bumrah was unavailable. But I think Siraj's recent form has been worrying enough that you're kind of going, okay, does this mean Akashdeep's going to play? And I think they probably give Siraj the first test, but if he doesn't perform, do they look at someone like Prasidi Krishna or, even Harshit Rana, particularly we're at Perth this first test, maybe they're looking for a taller bowler. I don't know. I think there are a lot of more questions around this Indian seam attack than I perhaps thought 6 months ago.
I don't think there are that many questions other than who partners Bumrah and Prasadi Krishna. Because if you have a look at the intra-squad game form and you have a look at the Australia A game form where Krishna played in those games, Krishna caused the Australians all sorts of problems with pace. He's now gone and caused the Indian batters in the intra-squad game all sorts of problems with his pace. The rumour has it that he's the one that hit KL Rahul and caused him a hit on the elbow. We know that there's another player in that top four that's picked up a finger injury. Not sure whether that was while batting or in the field, but regardless of the particulars of the circumstance, Prasad Krishna on this tour has caused both Australia A problems with his pace, and he's caused the Indian batters problems with his pace. We've also seen the Pakistan series that Australia have just played against Pakistan in white ball. Yes, it's white ball cricket, but what's caused Australia the most problems in that series? It's Haris Ralph and his raw pace. You have a look at the batting lineup for Australia and what are the weaknesses in the top three, top four? Well, you have a look at Marnus. What's his weakness at the moment? Traditionally, over the last 2 years, has been raw pace, 100 and 145 plus, testing his judgment outside off stump. So I would be saying get the raw pace in there as part of your lineup. And this is the beauty of this Indian side now, is you can mix and match these bowlers according to the conditions. But I'd want Krishna in there, I'd want Akash Deep in there, and I'd want Jasprit Bumrah in there if I was India.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the only thing I'd say is it's a shame Mohammad Shami's not fit, because then that's a really mouthwatering prospect. And I think then you're lining up Hazelwood, Stark, Cummins and Bumrah and Shami and, one of the two or three that we've talked about. And it's kind of almost a like for like in terms of quality. Yeah, definitely think India have got that luxury of the two spin options that can both obviously bat is going to be huge for them. The thing I'd say about about Siraj is, I think Australia is the best place for him to re-find that form. It's going to really, really suit him. So I'm with Baldy to an extent, and I know he's just trying to put a bit of moz on India, but I think they're well placed from a seam perspective to worry and hurry up those Australian batters. And we'll have, by the looks of it, I'm sure we'll come on to this now, by the looks of it, we're going to have at least one player batting significantly out of position in that Australian lineup, and some question marks around the moving deck chairs. Steve Smith's opening experiment, couldn't open a can of beans, so he's back down the order. We'll see what that does in terms of that dynamic of that Australian batting lineup as well.
But can I just, before we move on from the Indian pace bowlers, could I just say for Siraj, the key for him is to be aggressive. Australia is the perfect opponent and the perfect venue for him. Venues because I think it will suit his pace and bounce. But I think from an opponent perspective, him being able to get into the face of the Australians and be aggressive, like with his body language, with some of his verbal communication on the field, the way that he plays, Australia as being an opponent suits him down to the ground, because all of that is just going to raise his adrenaline, raise his stakes. If he can just control that into and channel it into the art of fast bowling rather than, having his headspace affected by those things, I think that is going to be a big benefit for him going forward. And I think if it was any opponent in any venue that you'd want Siraj to come out and show that aggression, it's this series, this opponent.
It's definitely a big series for him. I mean, the notes I have down here, 12 wickets in his last 15 innings, which doesn't make great reading. I know that majority of those tests, or I think all of them actually were at home.
Throw the home record out the window.
That's what I mean.
Don't worry about that.
I think but this means it's a big series for him, and he's got to perform now away from home in different conditions. But on the India, staying with India before we move to Australia, I think they've got some batting questions. Well, let's see what happens with Rohit, because congratulations to him. Just welcomed a baby boy into his family. We don't know if he's going to be there we think he's jumping on a plane pretty soon. We think that he, might be, that he will make it for this first test. If he's not, they've got a question about who comes in, whether they bring in one of the guys who opened in that India A, Australia A game. Rahul just hurt his elbow. Iswaran didn't exactly, knock down the door in terms of his output in those games. Dhruv Jurel was the one who probably performed the best out of that whole game. But can you kind of then you're sort of shuffling everybody? Gill's got to go up to open. Different people have got to move around. So I think some questions to answer there. And also, I don't know whether I'm fascinated to see what happens with Sarfraz, because he's been in that New Zealand series, he was just rocks and diamonds. He scored that brilliant 100. It seems like if he gets past 10, he's away and he's going to get, an awesome score. But he's a very scratchy starter. I think that Australian pitches might actually suit him in the fact that he doesn't, certainly from what I've seen at home, doesn't really lean on that front foot. He's kind of waiting for those short balls. So I think Australian pitches with a bit more bounce could suit him really well. But yeah, I'm just fascinated. I think there are some questions, and when I see these lineups for this first test, I'm quite interested what India is actually going to do.
The extra complicating factor is that Shubman Gill's picked up a finger injury and is now potentially in doubt. He might be fine, but all of those things are floating around the squad now. I think Rohit will be back for the first test. But the Gill finger injury, I think, is the potentially challenging one, because if you leave him out at number 3, suddenly there's a big hole to fill in that middle order for India. And you've got a guy like Iswaran or even, Sarfraz coming up the order.
Yeah.
Rahul potentially coming up the order. His form hasn't been great. I don't want to try and put too many mockers on India because they'll just prove me wrong. But there are some questions about that batting lineup, and Kohli and Rohit have been under the spotlight in terms of their form over the last wee while. Never write off a champion. I'm sure they'll bounce back in this big ticket series against Australia, but they have some things that they need to iron out pretty quickly early on in that first test in Perth.
Yeah, for me, the question marks really for that Indian batting lineup, Stu. I know we've just talked a lot about injuries and potential sort of changes in that middle order. Who are they going to pick? For me, it's about the top of the order. It's about Rohit Sharma and Yashasvi Jaiswal, who hasn't played against Australia yet. Let's not forget. So tough place to go and open the batting for that first 10 to 12 overs. Then, as we've said, it gets a little bit easier. But I think if you look at his Test record, really it's a small sample size, but the one team that he hasn't really had the results against that he's played against so far is South Africa. And that's probably a like-for-like comparison in terms of the quality of their seam attack, or as close to as possible. So look, that for me is going to be the biggest question mark. Is can he take, when you look at his career stats, averaging well over 50, can he get anywhere near sort of 45 or so throughout the course of this series? Because that's what they're going to need at the top of the order. In addition to Rohit Sharma probably finding a little bit of that form. I don't think we need to worry about Virat Kohli. I think he will, form is temporary, class is permanent, and all that kind of jazz. And this is probably his last tour to Australia, you would suggest. So look, he'll want to go out on a high, and you wouldn't bet against it. But those are the question marks for me in terms of that Indian batting lineup.
Really quickly, how do we think Rohit is going to approach batting against Australia, particularly in those first 10 to 12 overs? So traditionally, he's been the kind of guy who, and again, in white ball series in recent times, he's been the guy who said, I'm going to lay down a marker, I'm going to be super aggressive early on in the innings. He took a similar approach, I think, in the New Zealand series. Didn't quite come off for him as often as he would like. Given that we know that the Kookaburra is only going to really move around for 12, 15 overs maximum, even if you've got Cummins coming on in that sort of 12 to 15 over range, and he's a terrific first change bowler for Australia. How do we think Rohit's going to approach this? Is he going to try and lay down a marker to Stark and Hazelwood early doors and try and take them off their length, or is he going to give the first 10 or 12 overs to the bowler and then go, right, well, I've got 80 overs after that to attack?
What do you think, Bixie? Because I have a very clear idea in my head, but I'm keen to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily think he's going to be passive and give that 10 to 12 overs to the Australians. I think he's going to pick a method. And I kind of go back and look, forgive me a little bit of indulgence for 1 second. I think he'll probably go back and maybe play a little bit like Michael Vaughan did in that 2002-2003 Ashes, where he went away and really, really worked on pulling that sort of just back of a length ball, and he took that as his option to try and get on top of those guys when they just erred a little bit. That was the go-to shot. So I think he'll try and exert pressure, but I don't think he's going to, Bazball it around. I think he's going to try and find a way of trying to look at one or two shots that he might go to, and try and sort of show that they're there to put down that marker. But I don't think it's going to be like the first. It's not going to be a power play method for him. But yeah, Stu, interested to see with your undoubted batting prowess what you would do.
Well, yeah. I think what I would do, what I would actually do, and what I would like to do are two, drastically different things on the radar. In terms of what I think he should do, I think he should do exactly what you've said. You said it last week when we were talking about the New Zealand stuff, that I think if he looked back at that series, he would probably think, if I can just get through this period, then I can really capitalise. And even more so now with the Kookaburra. I think this is a massive series for him and for Kohli. And I actually think, we're sort of delving into key matchups now, but I think that this is such a huge matchup because I think that Indian side does generate a lot of their energy from Rohit. I really do think he's that kind of a leader. And if his form is down, I think it does drain on the other guys. And if they're seeing Kohli struggle, New Zealand was able to, in that series with their seamers, the ball jagging back in to both Rohit and Kohli caused them a lot of problems. Rohit, Sodhi and Henry back through the gate or into the pads. Those pads were a big target for Rohit Sharma. Same with Kohli. Kohli got caught down the leg gully off Will O'Rourke. I think they're going to look at those dismissals, I think, if you're the Australian attack and go, okay, like those Rohit Sharma pads have got a big target on them. But in Australia, you don't necessarily get as many LBWs because it's always going, the bounce takes it over. And like Binksy said, I think the short ball is something that Rohit likes to go at. I think he's going to still go pretty hard. I'll be very surprised if we see him at under a runner ball. And yeah, I think that could with Jaiswal probably going to be in a similar boat, although actually he's shown a bit of restraint in recent times. At the right times, I think he's been able to show restraint. Certainly did in a couple of his innings in the New Zealand series, although he did come out and go absolutely gangbusters in one of the tests as well. But yeah, I still think he's going to go pretty hard at these Australian bowlers, and if they bowl in his zone, it's not going to be leave. It's going to be here we go, trying to hit this to the boundary, and that's going to dictate a lot of the vibes for India as they go forward, because you've got the guys like Gill and all those. I think that top two for India, they set your tone, and then Gill and Kohli hopefully kind of build your platform, and then you get into Punt, who can change the game again. So I think that Rohit really has to be an important part for India for them to be successful in this series.
Border's the only one of us that's opened the batting in the last 24 hours. What do you think, Border?
My opening batting stint wasn't particularly successful this week, so I'm not qualified to talk. But I think batters that have been successful in Australia opening the batting, even the attacking ones, have had a really clear method. If Rohit is going in with a really clear plan to each bowler, and even if it's the plan of I'm going to hit Hazlewood off his length by pulling anything that's remotely short, good plan. If his plan to Stark is I'm going to let Stark have the good ball because I know that there's one coming that I can hit, it's either going to be short or it's going to be down the leg side, I can hit that.
In-swinger.
And if the in-swinger is not working for Stark, Rohit is uniquely positioned to be able to attack him off front or back foot. If that ball is straight up and down, Rohit is able to capitalise on that because he can go over the top of the off or onside, off front and back foot. So all of those things, I think, are things that work in Rohit's favour. If he tries to hit the good balls for 4 or 6, I think Australia will undo him. But if he waits long enough to get the bad ball from Stark, or he figures out that he can hit Hazlewood off his length, and I think Hazlewood can be hit off his length because he's so metronomic, that if a batter can pick up the length early, particularly a guy who's got as good a hand-eye as Rohit, and he can either get down the pitch and bang him over the top of the infield down the ground, or he can rock back and hit him with that. He's got that pull shot that kind of doesn't have to be that short, and he can pick it up and hit it for 6 over the leg side. I think those are the shots that he should be looking for. If he's too aggressive, I think Australia will undo him. But if he's just waiting for the bad ball or he targets Hazelwood, I think he can have a good series.
We probably should talk a little bit about Australia, and maybe your thing on openers is probably a nice segue into them, because I think that's the only squad question for them, really, isn't it? I mean, when I look through that lineup, it's a fairly settled lineup apart from McSweeney at the top. And I mean, how are you feeling about him going into this series, which now is suddenly, we thought a few months ago that this was sort of, it's always going to be a big series, but we kind of thought, okay, well, there isn't that much riding on it because both these two teams are going to be in the World Test Championship final. Now it looks like there's a chance maybe not even, neither of them could be in that World Test Championship final. So there are a number of things riding on this series, let alone just it being Australia, India, and the last two series for, particularly in Australia, have been super, super interesting.
So Cameron Green's injury obviously has made the selection problem paramount, because I think if Cameron Green wasn't injured, Australia would have manufactured an opener from that existing 6. And I think Ronald McDonald's other burger chains are available as national coaches. His philosophy has been, I'm going to pick the best 6 batters that I think are available to me, and I will figure out the order in which they should bat. Now Australia have had to go, okay, cool, well, the best 6 aren't necessarily all available. What are we going to do about this opening position? Because Steve Smith has moved down to number 4, the position that was vacated by Cameron Green, having suffered that injury. And now you've got a scenario where Australia's selectors have decided that Nathan McSweeney is best positioned, now that he's had one game opening the batting in the Australia A game, to now open the batting for his country. And whether or not that is an inspired decision to elevate a guy who is in form at the moment to the top of the order to partner Usman Khawaja, or whether or not it's a decision that maybe was born out of a lack of viable options to replace Smith with a traditional opener, remains to be seen. I think there will be people in Australia who are in you need an opener to open the batting. People will be there. You need Sam Constance to open the batting because he's the future. And there are people who are saying, well, who's the guy who's in the best form at the moment? And if you're picking the guy who's in the best form this season so far, of the 4 candidates that they've looked at, it is Nathan McSweeney. Really, it is Nathan McSweeney. Whether or not his ability to open the batting for Australia, having not done so previously, is the right move. I think Ed Cowan's come out and had some pretty strong comments this week about, and he backed it up with some stats, having a look at, well, when Nathan McSweeney comes in for South Australia in the first 10 runs of a game, his average isn't that great. And if you have a look at his scores in those scenarios, there aren't many scores over 50 in that scenario. So that is one set of stats. The other set of stats are, well, he is scoring runs for South Australia. He's scoring runs for Australia A. He's the best placed guy the selectors feel to open the batting for Australia in this Test series. And look, now that they've given him a go, they've got to stick with him, because if they give him a go and then discard him, the next guy's kind of come in, and it's going to be that kind of revolving door of batters, just like we had with the revolving door of Australian spinners after Shane Warner. It's just like we're looking for the next guy to come in and nail it straight away. And Nathan McSweeney now should be having 18 months to 2 years to nail down his spot, because he needs to be the guy who's embedded in the Australian team when Usman Khawaja retires in 2 or 3 years' time. He needs to be the senior opener from a succession plan perspective. So, when Sam Constance is ready, I'm sure he'll be the next name that they're looking at from a selection point of view. But now McSweeney's really got it all on him to make this post a winner in this series. And it's not going to be easy. Bumrah, Deep, Prasadi Krishna, whoever they select, are going to be asking some serious questions of his technique.
Yeah, but Bordy, I agree with everything that everything that you've said. That the question that's running in my mind, I'll come to in a sec. But I think there isn't that weight of players battering down the door with 1,000-run seasons and averaging 55 like there was when you had your Jamie Cox, your Siddons, Martin Love, all these guys that were just put in, literally they were going out and doing everything they possibly could. And that was putting, probably the right kind of pressure on Hayden and Langer and Ponting and War and whoever was in the side at that point, because they knew they needed to continue to score runs. The question I have, though, is when we're looking at a spare batting spot in the middle order, we very, very rarely go, is he going to be able to bat at 4 or 5 or 6? We've got this sort of this real bugbear around opening the batting being so different. And I think when we look at skills in the game, I don't think the difference between batting 1 and 4 is as big as, for example, when we talk about bowlers, being a new ball bowler or being a first change bowler. That is a completely different skill set, because you're not going to get all of the advantages of a new ball to bowl with, and that's often the way that a new seamer comes in. They're probably at the top of the order with a brand, and particularly in Australia, a brand new Kookaburra ball seaming it around all over the shop, and then they're coming on first change. Completely different kettle of onions. Yeah. So I think that we have this conversation. I hope he comes in and does well. And it's really, really easy to come out with all those stats. I saw that Ed Cowan piece, Baldy. Yeah, do you know what? If you're coming in at number 4 or 5 within the first 10 runs of a game, you're pretty much in the poo already. So your stats aren't necessarily going to be great if you're 8 for 3 or 3 for 8, as you insist on calling it. But yeah, I hope he goes. Yeah, I hope he goes well. But I think it is just the fact that they've not gone back to a Bancroft. They've not gone back to a Marcus Harris. So that they're picking, hopefully, this guy as the next cab off the rank, and going to let him run his engine in for a period of time and give him an extended run in the team. But Baldy, any other question marks for you in terms of lineup? What is the middle order going to be what we expect it to be? Marnus at 3, Smith at 4, Head at 5, etc.
Yeah, Marsh at 6. I think the personnel's not going to change. I think the question marks that are going to be asked is, let's unpick this a little bit, and let's open the kimono a little bit and have a look at what's going on in that Australian engine room, because in the last 18 months, 2 years, that Australian engine room hasn't been as productive as Australian fans would like it to be. It hasn't been as productive as the Australian team would want it to be. Here's where I think opening the batting is a specialist skill. In the white ball format, you can take risks, and if it doesn't come off, there's a guy behind you, and there's a limited number of balls that you have to score runs and take your opportunity, particularly in T20 cricket. So risk-taking and failure is more accepted in those formats. In Test cricket, not so. The other complicating factor, and you've touched on it, Adam, in your analysis as well, is that the ball swings for 12 to 15 overs, and that is a very different set of conditions in red ball cricket as it is in white ball cricket. Because even in white ball cricket, it might go a little bit early doors, but traditionally, the wicket in particular is straight up and down. So you don't get as much variability in the surface conditions in white ball cricket as you do in Test cricket, and you don't get as much variability or ability to swing the ball early in Test cricket. There are also a lot more guys in the slips cordon in the first 10 to 12 overs of a Test match as well. So mistakes get punished. They don't get accepted as part and parcel of being an attacking cricketer. So all of those things are unique situations that you don't get in the majority of your preparation, which is white ball cricket. So it does become a very specific skill set opening the batting. And that's why I'm surprised that Australia, from a selection policy, that mentality didn't go with an established batter like Bancroft or Harris. Bancroft and Harris have been tearing up trees the last 2 seasons. Harris in England in particular, but Bancroft in the Sheffield Shield. The problem is at the wrong time, they ran out of runs. They couldn't buy a run in either of those 2 series those 2 games against India. So I think that's the problem for them in terms of being able to get in that Australian team. If they had been scoring runs, they would have been in no problem. For the middle order, Marnus is a particular concern for me. If we have a look, Binksy, at the records of Australians in that last 18 months, so let's sort of take January 2023 onwards. Marsh averages 46, Karaja averages 46, Smith averages 37, so Smith's below 40 the last 18 months. Green averages 38. Travis Head, surprisingly 37. He's been a shining light for Australia's batting, but still doesn't average 40.
Yeah, I would have thought it's better than that.
And then Marnus Labuschagne, 33, 750s. But yeah, his average is not even 35 through his last 30-odd bats at the crease. So those are the concerning numbers. I think Australia needs way more out of their engine room in this series than those numbers there. But from a personnel perspective, those guys are locked in unless there's an injury, as far as I can see.
Well, and I think if the importance, again, when I look through the jobs that all those Australian batters have, the importance of that top order to at least kind of see out the initial attack from Bumrah in particular. He's the lead guy, but the rest of that Indian seam attack, whatever sort of form it takes, because the sort of match winners I see in that lineup are Head and Marsh.
Yes.
Those are the guys who, if they come in at 280 for 4, the game can be gone from you very, very quickly in the way that they go about things. If they come in at 100 for 4, suddenly,
or 30 for 4.
Well, yeah. If you're being very optimistic as an Indian fan, then yes, the game is completely different for how they can go about the risk taking that they do, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, I really think that much like we talked about for Rohit and against that incredible Australian seam attack, it's really going to be key for Bumrah and that Indian attack to take wickets up front, to put those guys in positions where they actually have to build innings or try and hit their way out of trouble rather than be the icing on the cake, which they've been in the best Australian performances in recent times. Head and Marsh have been the icing on the cake, and then you're in big trouble as a test side.
Can I throw one left field thought out there before we move on from the Australian batting lineup? You have a look at that batting lineup now. Marsh doesn't bowl much these days. More will be asked of him, I think, this summer to support the pace battery of those Australian quicks, plus Nathan Lyon as the spinner. Just throwing this out there. Travis Head, good part-time bowler, but part-time bowler. McSweeney, reasonable part-time bowler, but part-time bowler. Marsh doesn't bowl much anymore. Australia, what they're going to miss from Cameron Green is his ability to be a wicket-taking bowler in that kind of 10 to 15 overs that you kind of need from your fifth bowler in a test match. So one of the things that might surprise a lot of people but may not surprise the Australian selectors is whether or not Bo Webster gets a look at some point in this series as an all-rounder batting at 6 or batting at 7 for Australia. They push Carey up and they pick one less batter, particularly if there's a guy who's struggling. And I think the balance of the team to have that extra bowler, because Bo Webster's been taking a lot of wickets for Tasmania. I know he's playing a lot of games at Bellerive over on Hobart, which favours his style, but his potential emergence as a balancing act to counter the all-rounders that you get out of Jadeja and Ashwin in that middle order might be something the Australian selectors look at some point in this series.
Yeah, but Bordy, I was going to mention that and ask how much you thought Mitch Marsh was going to bowl. I'd not really thought of the Bo Webster option. I guess the issue with that is it really does elongate that tail a little bit, or not tail, but certainly the way the lineup would work. It puts a bit more pressure on McSweeney. What would you need to see out of him in the first 2 or 3 games of the series to then consider going in with one less, frontline batter, so to speak? My other question for you, and this really for me is the only question about the Australia bowling lineup. I think we know exactly what we're going to get out of Hazlewood, Stark and Cummins, and Boland if he comes into the side at any point with workload management, as they call it these days. But my question is, Nathan Lyon, Baldy, has had a few little niggles and injuries over the course of the last 24 months or so. If he's on the park, I don't think there's any question mark around his ability. Who comes in if he does pick up an injury throughout the course of the series? Do you think that they bring in the next best spinner, or do you think they shuffle the deck chairs again?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think if you asked me that question 12 months ago, I would have said Todd Murphy and I wouldn't have even batted an eyelid. I think he had a really good test debut series. I think he's a very exciting prospect for the future. His form for Victoria has been good. But the emergence of Corey Richiccioli for Western Australia has also been another factor that I think will throw a little bit of a wrinkle in there for selectors. And I think he's starting to emerge as potentially another option for Australia going forward. I think it would be between those two guys. I don't think we're going to go back to the Swepson I don't think we're going to go back to the Kuhnemann I don't think we're going to look elsewhere other than those two fellas. But I think that the question will be, how do Australia balance those seam bowlers? Because I think they are going to need some fresh legs in there at some point in this series. Australia got away with it last year in that they didn't have to bowl their seam bowlers for a long time and big long spells in the Test series that they played. And you had a look at like the West Indies game, the last Test of the summer. Australia looked a bit flat there at times with the ball, and that was on the back of 6 tests or 5 or 6 tests, but they weren't really taxing. I expect the Australian bowlers to be taxed a lot more heavily in this series than they have been in the past. So I think Boland, even if you only used them in Melbourne, or even if you went, okay, we're going to use Boland in Melbourne and we're going to use Boland in Adelaide or wherever it is, just to give the guys a break and give them some freshness and keep that hunger going and keep the legs firing, I think that would be the only thing that Australia look at. But it all depends on how long they're in the field for, right? And crucially, I think as Adam pointed out on a previous podcast, how long the Australian batters can bat for to give their bowlers a break, to give them some rest. And if Australia find themselves in a bit of a hole and they're relying on Stark and Cummins to dig Australia out of the poo a little bit and score valuable lower order runs and then turn around and go back and bowl again, that's all of that stuff is going to add up for Australia.
And I know we want to get into predictions and sort of how we see this series playing out, but I will just say I am super fascinated to see another version of the Ashwin Lyon battle because Ashwin was superb last time in Australia. Lyon, he just keeps delivering. He keeps kind of delivering. He said he's got a couple. Said he was asked about retirement recently. He said, it's far too early to be thinking about that. Still think I've got 2 or 3 years, good years left in me. And you sort of think about the Australian pitches having a bit more bounce than some other areas, and Lyon is so good when he can get that dip and bounce. He's such a dangerous bowler and such a great complement to those seamers. So yeah, I'm super excited for that battle because it feels like Ashwin always comes up with something special when he's against Nathan Lyon.
Well, guys, let's move to predictions and try and keep this one this planned 40-minute episode under an hour 10. Let's go to Michael first and get out the India win from the panel. But yeah, Border, your prediction for the series?
Well, I'm going to surprise you. I think Australia are going to win this series, and I think Australia are going to win it 3-2. I think it's going to be a very competitive series. I think India have their best chance when they're in Melbourne, and I think they have their best chance when they're in Brisbane, because by that stage they'll be acclimatised to the conditions. And I think those 2 tests are going to be the tests that India are going to play very, very well. Now, that would mean Australia are up 2-0, then it comes back 2-2, and then we have a real live test in Adelaide. I'm hoping that there's a live test the last test is in Sydney, so the last test would be a live test. That's what I'm hoping for from a series perspective. I think Australia can win 3-2, but if I was India, definitely those are the 2 tests that I would really target for my batting to fire. But they've got to fire it from Perth at the get-go.
One thing I did want to quickly ask you, we don't need to go too deep into it, but how do you think Australia will manage the tempo of how they play their cricket? Because I think, you guys talked about, certainly when we talked about the Ashes, and how Australia kind of combated England's aggressive style. And I do think India will at times, we'll see Jaiswal, we might see Sharma, we might see Punt get into situations where they are putting the pressure on Australia. And when we saw that from England do that from ball one, we saw people on the boundary. We saw them play. I hesitate to call it a conservative style, but they certainly tried to reduce the impact of those moments. Do you think, I saw an article just the headline sort of saying Jaiswal expects to fight fire with fire. Do we think Australia is going to be playing a fiery brand of cricket, or are they just going to be very methodical, which I think that's sort of been their brand under Pat Cummins? They've been quite a methodical side.
They won't fight fire with the bat. They might with the ball. They might be quite aggressive with the ball in an attempt to take early wickets. But I don't think we don't know enough about how Australia are going to bat because they've got new blood in there, because there's some uncertainty about their middle orders form. I don't think that we've got enough data to be able to make that prediction accurately. I think Australia will be aggressive with the ball, though. It remains to be seen what they'll do with the bat, because Khawaja's not naturally an aggressive stroke maker style batter. He's an accumulator. So I don't think it suits Australia to try and play India at that game with the bat.
Yeah. I don't think they'll be shy to put... Go on.
Make him make a prediction rather than asking me more questions.
Make a prediction, Stu.
I've got 2-2 down on my sheet of paper. If you'd have asked me before this New Zealand series, I would have actually said India quite comfortably. Before this New Zealand series, I thought India was the number one side in the world, sort of hands down, and didn't really think that was a question. Before that series, we saw them against Bangladesh, kind of pull wins out of the fire when it seemed like that wasn't possible. Maybe, like we talked about the last couple of weeks, I think a lot of the guys like Jaiswal, guys like Pant, Gill, some of them were papering over some of the cracks that had been there for a little while in terms of Sharma's form and Virat's form. But I still think that going to Australia, that they're very well suited, and I think this will be, like you said, a very, very competitive series. And I do think that we going away from home, getting a bit more bounce, getting on, hopefully I think what will be a bit more batter-friendly wickets than we saw. I thought that was a great series in terms of the wickets we saw, the different challenges we saw from the India-New Zealand series, the way those pitches played out. But I think the batters in particular for India will probably enjoy going to Australia and getting a bit more bounce, getting it coming on a bit nicer. And so, I think some of those Indian batters will thrive in those conditions. And I think that we'll see a point where it's 2-2 and it's a live series, maybe going into the last, or maybe we're going to be going into the final game with someone trying to hang on, or, whatever it is. I think we'll see a very close series, and that's why I couldn't split them 2-2.
Yeah. Really quickly on the tempo, I don't think we'll be surprised that Cummins might stick a sweeper out if he needs to. I think the difference in Australia is the grounds are a lot bigger. He needed to do that to an extent in England and India. But yeah, I think I'm not going to say Australia will play conservatively, but I think they'll be, as you said, I think methodical or pragmatic. In terms of series prediction for me, I'm going to go 2-2 as well, with the moral victory to India. And clearly, that's mainly because Australia can't have a moral victory. It's not allowed, given their history and their background. But look, I think it's going to be a really, really tight series. I hope it's a tight series. And like you, Stu, I do hope we're going down the stretch with all on the line at that Sydney Test match. For Australia, I hope they don't rue the fact that they've not used the Gabba as the place to ambush India first up. But yeah, look, I'm really, really looking forward to this series. For me, other than an Ashes Boxing Day Test match, I am so looking forward to getting a few pigs in blankets, bit of turkey on Christmas night here in the UK. Midnight is when the Test match starts here, and watching a couple of hours of that with my dad and my brother. Really, really looking forward to this series.
Before you take us out, I'm going to put you on the spot. If this series is not a tight series, if someone runs away with this series 4-1, 5-0, both of you, who is the winner in that scenario? Australia for you?
Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, last week we sort of saying India doesn't turn into a bad side overnight, and I still don't think they will. I really genuinely think this is going to be a fascinating series. But I think, at least in my head, that the frailties at different aspects, there are a lot more questions I have around this Indian side, and I can see them going. I can see Bumrah being, the lone seamer if things don't go well for that attack. I can see, some of those batters struggling, and suddenly, okay, Dhruv Jurel's got to come in, who I actually think will feature at some point in the series, will play a big part. I still think Jaiswal will have a big series. yeah, like I said, I think it'll be a tight series. But now, if you made me have to pick a winner, I think it's Australia.
Look, it's certainly possible that India dominate Australia. I think a lot would have to go right for India. I think more would have to go right for India to dominate Australia than for Australia to be able to dominate India. If one side gets on a roll, I think it's more likely that Australia, in their home conditions, would get on a roll and be able to exploit those game after game. I think India would have to have a lot more go right for them to be able to dominate Australia. But on the back of Virat, on the back of Pant, on the back of Bumrah, those guys in particular, don't underestimate anyone in that Indian side. They have the ability to do it. I just think Australia are more likely to be able to do it.
Fantastic. Well done. We've tipped it over the hour marker
Well done.
on the timer. Well done, us. That is all we do literally have time for. All of our data plans have just been, we've gone into paying for excess baggage, haven't we? But we will be back later in your feeds for a little bit of a roundup of other stuff around the cricketing world in a This Week in Cricket episode. But for the Border-Gavaskar preview, any further business? No?
Take us away.
Going, gone. We'll see you next week on the Top Order podcast. Good night.